In England, still, if you go into a bookshop in England and you look at the history section, half of the books are the Second World War, and the other half are either who came first, which apparently is important for some people, as opposed to what did you do with the telescope once you've invented it, or thank God we're not German. And history today in England, if you look at history today, if you look at the History Channel, if you look at history documentaries, often you will actually, more often than not, we mean thank God we're not the French, but we like beating up on the Germans, and I like beating up on the French, so I'll do a little bit of that today. And actually it got even worse because there were idiots like this parading around. I don't know if you guys know this man, but avoid him like the plague. He's a very good historian of banking, but he's also written, he's called Niall Ferguson. He's written these books which are basically, as you can see from this one, Civilization, the West and the Rest. It's a rehearsal of the story many of you have probably heard along the way, and which probably doesn't make sense to many of you, which is why the West is great and the rest aren't yet as great as we are. And of course there's a problem there. Because if you tell the story like that, then you don't understand the world as it is today. And this is Hayder's point, when he put up those two quotes at the beginning. You don't understand the world today, you get a picture like this, and if you look at this map, this is an animated GIF, these are what we call failed states, in other words, countries that didn't get it, or that haven't got there yet. And if you look at this map, as it goes through, you'll notice that all the real danger spots, in fact, everywhere we study at my university, which is Africa, the Near Middle East, and East Asia, apparently, according to this, has failed. Which you also probably know isn't right. Because if you read the newspapers to you today, you know that China is coming on strong, you know that India is coming on strong, and actually, the most failed place, which is, according to the old story, Africa, these days is coming on stronger than anybody. Growth rates in Africa in the last 10 years have outpaced any other part of the planet. In 2000, The Economist newspaper published an article or a headline story about Africa called The Hopeless Continent. This was the image that accompanied the cover story a few months back, and it said Africa Rising. So the problem is we have a story about the world which doesn't work. The story about the world is white folk like me, although I'm a mongrel, we're all mongrels at the end of the day. But white folk like me made a great world, and then everybody else is trying to catch up. That story doesn't work, it never worked, it doesn't describe history, and so we need a better story. And what I want to do today in about, 45 minutes now, is give you a slightly better story. And actually, it's kind of simple, because it only takes 5 minutes. You can do the history of the world in 5 minutes, but first we need an Adam and an Eve. So, sorry, you're going to be Adam, and you're going to be Eve, for the purposes of this illustration. I'm going to put this over there because it's a bit interactive, so here we go. Right, the history of the world in 5 minutes. First two people on the planet, Adam and Eve, great, fabulous, wonderful, and they're surrounded by all these fruits and these vegetables, and it's all dandy. And over time, if you are historically normal, you will have more than 2 kids. That's what happens in most societies over most of human history. And actually, you are going to have 6 kids. Sorry about that, but you're going to have 6 kids. There you go. You've got 6 kids, first generation 6 kids, and at this point, something really interesting happens. Because if you're normal historically, in other words, if you're average historically, then you'll have more kids than will replace yourselves. And you also can grow or gather more than you can consume. In other words, you generate surplus. You generate a surplus of babies, or you generate a surplus of stuff, food, shelter, housing. And if you generate a surplus, then something very interesting happens. Actually, you don't need everybody, all 8 of you now, to do the farming. Different people can do different things. You can begin to divide your labor. And the original division of labor, of course, is gender. Basically, women do all the work and men don't do anything. Or men go hunting, right? Men go away for a week and they come back at the end of the week and they say, "Darling, I have a rabbit." And the wife goes, "Congratulations, sit down, watch the TV, just shut up," and gets on with doing all the work. So first you have a gender division of labor, but over several generations maybe, different people can begin to do different kinds of jobs. So maybe at this point, you guys are all retired, congratulations. You guys are doing the farming. You are doing other bits and pieces. In other words, you can maybe make ceramics to hold the stuff that you're growing, to keep it over the winter. You guys may be taking care of animals and so on. You begin to get a division of labor, and then eventually, of course, as you grow more and more and more over here, you'll begin to see different people occupying different places in the social hierarchy. Some people have more wealth, some people have less wealth. And at that point it's tricky, because obviously the people who have less wealth are not going to be terribly happy, and so the people who have more wealth, sorry, it's still you guys, this is the original family, who hold most of central London. Let's call you the Dukes of Westminster, why not? Yeah? You guys are going to have to invent institutions to convince these poor guys that actually the way the world is the way the world should be. So you invent things like property, and you invent things like courts, and you invent things like police to make sure that you don't nick all the stuff that they have in their storehouse. And then one day you have a genius idea, because actually employing all these people to police everybody else is quite expensive. And it's so much cheaper if you can just hire a priest. Priests are great. I'm not pouring scorn on religion, I go to church every Sunday, but a priest is great because a priest can convince you to think that the world in which you're living is the best of all possible worlds. And if you can do that, you're not going to have to hire as many policemen or judges or courts or something, and that's it. That's the history of the world. That's the whole thing. It actually took 2.5 minutes, I'm guessing. So we can all go and have lunch? No, I'll flick through it because it's useful to think in these ways. If you think about it, what you have in most human societies is you have production and reproduction, growing stuff, having babies. Over time, if you produce enough stuff and you reproduce sufficiently, then you will have differentiation of gender, of labor, of wealth, and so on. In order to sustain that society, over time you'll invent political institutions. And of course, all of this is underpinned by culture, representing things in a world so that, for example, the idea of property makes sense to you, or the idea of God makes sense to you, or the idea of behaving in a particular way makes sense to you. You have economics, you have society, you have politics, and you have culture. In other words, if you do history at university, you're going to do all the other subjects as well. So we're better. And of course, all of this relies on a particular kind of nature. You are inhabiting a natural world from which you begin to get the things that you need. Now, of course, this is way too simple. You know, if I had an extra 5 minutes, I could get you all to pick holes in the story I've just described. This is way too simple. First of all, it's actually Marxist. Don't worry about that. What that means is I went from economy to society to politics to culture. In other words, culture was the last thing, right? As you guys all know, ideas can change the world, right? Whether you had the tent encampment around St. Paul's, the Occupy movement, things like that, Marx himself changed the world. We have a Labour Party still in England, which is an embodiment of ideas through which you change the way in which people produce and consume, and so on and so forth, right? Politics can easily affect society. We know all this. So there are feedback loops, in other words. Another problem with this. I started by saying that assuming that you're living in a nice environment where you've got enough stuff to grow, this happens. But it doesn't always. This is a woodblock by the same guy as the Adam and Eve woodblock. This is Dura, middle of the 17th century. And these are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Those of you who've read the New Testament will know in the book of Revelation there are 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And if they get going, then all hell breaks loose. Specifically, if they get going, then none of the things I was talking about might work. Because actually nature might not provide enough for you. You might have famine, you might have pestilence. And if you have famine and pestilence, people die. If you have war, in other words, if other societies begin to get jealous or aggressive, they'll come in and they'll rampage. Look at what's happening in Ukraine. So far, a reasonably non-violent conflict. If that flares out of control, then we're going to see a different result. Sometimes you'll have conquest, again, a non-violent conquest. If any of these things happen, then what I described will not occur. But nonetheless, this gives us a pretty good starting point for thinking about history. When we're talking about history, we're talking about something that belongs somewhere in this diagram. And so that's where I'm going to start. Right, the first 11,000 years, and it doesn't take very long. If you look at a map of the Old World, you will see that in most parts of the Old World, steppe and desert, these areas, you can't really grow stuff. You can grow stuff a little bit in what's now Europe, you can grow stuff a little bit down here, South Asia, importantly, and you can grow stuff throughout this Eastern Asian region. What that means is it's in those places where you can actually grow things that beginning around 11,000 years ago, people begin to grow things, and over time, therefore, you get civilizations emerging. Civilizations, complicated societies, places where religion takes off, these emerge in the places that you can, by and large, grow things. And so out of these places, we begin to see over time complex societies, complicated states, what we call civilizations, and in time you also begin to see the emergence of the great thinkers. This is obviously Socrates and Aristotle in the Mediterranean, the Buddha in India, and Chow Yun-fat, also playing Confucius in China. Sorry for the Chow Yun-fat poster, I'm just a fan. What can you do? It's a quite recent poster because the Chinese government is now beginning to reevaluate the historical past. So you get complex societies emerging, you get ideas emerging. And over time, these ideas and also stuff begins to flow along what we sometimes call the Silk Route, but not only the Silk Route, you can see there are sea routes as well. The world is not just discrete places, London, Birmingham, Dubai, China. Yeah, it's not just discrete places. Over time, these places begin to get linked together, and this happens very early. It happens by around 0, according to the Christian calendar, around the time of the birth of Christ. We already see a network growing up within the old world. This image here is actually a very interesting one. It comes from the northwest of currently India. It's actually from Pakistan, what is now Pakistan. It's an image of the Buddha, but you might notice it looks like a Greek sculpture. In other words, ideas, images, these things are flying all over the world, very, very early, 2,000 years ago. It's encouraged this linking of the world up, what somebody has once called an old world web, using a computer metaphor, right? It's encouraged, of course, by the spread of Islam. From the 7th century onwards, Islam begins to spread, first out of the Arabian Peninsula, through the nearer Middle East, over North Africa into Europe. Spain was, of course, Islamic for most of its medieval and kind of 500 years or more of history, and then even further west, and eventually ends up all the way in Southeast Asia. As Islam spreads, it takes trade with it. A lot of early Islamic communities are actually trading communities, as some of you may well know. So you begin to get ideas flowing, goods flowing, and this increases and increases and increases, and it's encouraged even more, actually, by the Mongol invasions. Our image of Genghis Khan is of a terrifying conqueror. What happens as the Mongols take over most of this area is that this too encourages trade. So already, way before Columbus, we have a world, an old world, still Europe, although it's irrelevant, look how it's been chopped off. I like this map because Europe doesn't exist very well. Asia, Africa, and the Middle East is beginning to get linked together, which means that by the time you get to 1300, you have this. This is actually a trading system. It's centered on China. China produces the most sophisticated goods in the world. It flows through here, which is the most active economic part of the world, and then is linked into, finally, through Islamic trade to Europe, all the way over here. Okay, what happens next used to be a story of this. When I went to school, not so many years ago, the story was to the Age of Discovery, what we call the Age of Discovery. This is Christopher Columbus, this is Portugal in the green, and Spain, spreading around the world, and look at all the empty spaces on the map. Presumably anywhere colored white here is just waiting to be discovered. You're sitting on the east coast of Africa looking at your watch and thinking, I haven't been discovered yet, I don't know, I mean, I need one of these guys from Spain to come and tell me who I am. Otherwise I'm never going to be discovered, and unless I'm discovered, then who do I know who I am? Because it's a stupid word, right? It is not the case that until 1492, all of these communities in all of these regions did not have an active, vibrant, commercially successful life. But we used to talk about the Age of Discovery as if it was an unchallenged truth that until Columbus started sailing the ocean blue, nothing happened. It's simply not true. A slightly more complicated story is this one, which I'll let you read. And there will be a test. No, there won't be a test. That's a more interesting story, I think. So we've got a Chinese economy taking off. Sounds familiar. We need to buy stuff from them. We've got to buy it with Spanish silver. We've got that silver from what's today Peru. Some of it goes straight across the Philippines. We've also got coffee ricketing around before Starbucks, way before Starbucks, and forget Costa. Please don't drink Costa. We've got Louis XIV doing something in France. We've got it on Chinese porcelain down here. It's actually a Muslim drink, of course. It's made or sweetened with sugar. This is a complicated world. And it's a world that's not premised on one part of the world being at the center. Although one part is, that part is China, because it's the Chinese economy that is the engine of the pre-modern world. So what we need is a more complicated story, and the story starts with death, actually the plague. If you remember pestilence, spreading out of China in the 14th century, over here, spreading through the trade routes, hitting the Middle East hard, spreading all the way to Europe. The death toll here is extraordinary. It kills 90% of the province in China, where it spreads out of. It kills, I've got some stats somewhere, I think it's about 40% of the ports in the Middle East. It kills about a third of London. This is a global plague, a global epidemic, which completely disrupts the way things have been going on before. This is in the 14th century. This is around 1332 originally. Okay? What happens in the wake of this is very interesting. On the one hand, this leads to the fall of political regimes. Regimes collapse. If you lose 90% of your population, you don't have a leg to stand on. But what's most interesting is that actually it doesn't kill the network. Some of the parts of the network go down, and this computer metaphor is very useful. You can take out one bank of servers, but if you've got a backup, you can route round it. And actually that's what's happening in the 15th century. You can see trade, this flow of goods, these flow of ideas beginning to go in new directions. It's in the 15th century that East Africa takes off. Mombasa, Mogadishu, all those places begin to emerge as important, powerful city-states. And it's in the wake of this plague that actually Europe begins to spread. And Europe spreads for a very simple reason. Europe has been cut off from the flow of goods from Asia, because the Ottomans have begun to develop their empire in the Middle East. And so it's at this point that European explorers begin to spread around the world. This is Columbus's boat. This is a Chinese boat at the same period. If we write a story that just talks about this, we've got something a little bit wrong. Already at the beginning of the 15th century, these boats are going as far as East Africa. They stop, and the Europeans keep going, because the Europeans still need to discover the source of wealth, whereas the Chinese don't have anything to discover. But what happens in the wake of this is the emergence of a very complicated global system here. What you can still see from this, though, is all the trade, all the roads lead back to China, even as we begin to get something new emerging in the New World. I'm going to break this down very quickly for you. The early modern world, in other words, the world from about 1500 to 1750, is a world of agrarian empires. What this means is basically these rest on agriculture. It's the same if you look at China, India, Iran, Ottomans in the Middle East. It's the same with the Russian Empire or the Habsburg Empire, which dominates much of Europe. You have some other people knocking around in this period. You have minorities who don't necessarily fit in these governing structures. You have commercial cities like Algiers, Venice, Muscat, Oman, these places. You have stateless societies, what we call stateless societies, large parts of Africa, the Americas, the Pacific, and of course we have the strange people who inhabit our neck of the woods, including London, commercial societies. What this means is that in this period, and it's a really important period, which is why I'm spending a little bit of time on it, you have an Asian world order. This is the order of the early modern world. This is Jahangir IV, Mughal emperor. Those are his dates. And as you can see from this portrait, this is Jahangir, a portrait. He has much more time from a religious master and a Muslim subpotentate than King James. This is King James of England, who's in contact, but who is way down the pecking order. This is the artist himself. You can begin to see here how the hierarchy works. Similarly, if you go to an image in Japan, this is from the mid-17th century, this is an image from Japan, my neck of the woods, of all the people in the world. The English are down here. You can see what we're getting to in the middle of the 17th century. At the same time, of course, the trade is flowing. We have huge demand for this. If you go to museums like the Victoria and Albert, stuff like that, you'll see huge amounts of porcelain coming out of China and Japan in these years, as well as fabrics from India. And this is around 1700. So it's an Asian world order. Asia is the richest part of the world. Asia is providing the goods that we all want. Asia dominates international exchanges until 1750. What about Europe? Europe you can do in three equations. the whole of European history in 3 equations. Sorry about this, anybody who's wedded to European history, but we're going to debunk it right now. Europe is basically about 3 things. Europe is about people with land wanting more land. Let's call them kings. If you want more land, you need money for it. You go and get loans from the City of London. The second bit of the puzzle is capitalism. If you want more money, you need to expand your sphere of operation, which means that you get more capital. And you also have the church, which wants more souls, missionaries, in other words. What this means is that Europe is made up, unlike the agrarian empires, of competing states. There is competition between these states. There is not one all-powerful empire under which other people are included. You have competing states. When you have competing states, of course, that sets off tensions within the states. If I'm going to go and wage war against that country over there, I'm going to tax you to finance my military. And when you tax people, they don't like it. And so you have revolutions. The English one was in the middle of the 17th century. The Americans, the French, the derivative. And what that means is that also you have pressures leading outwards into expansion to go and grab more of the pie. So you can grow your state, so that you can grow your piece of the economic puzzle. And what this means most profoundly, of course, is a story in America, the New World. This is the Spanish, having been invited to a dinner party, killing their hosts. Or at least the Aztec ruler thought he was inviting them to a dinner party. They didn't quite get the message. Always write the email properly. Yeah. This is actually the beginning of genocide in the Americas. The genocide lasts until the late 19th century, until the last Indian tribes are slaughtered by the United States government. Most of the time you don't need to slaughter the native peoples because, of course, they have no immunity biologically, which means that in some cases 90% of indigenous populations are dead within a generation. From disease that the Europeans bring over. And it's not just native people, some people call this an ecocide because actually the effect on the natural environment in the Americas is as destructive. Taking things like sheep or pigs to places where they don't exist already changes things quite dramatically. So first you get rid of the native people, and then of course you can begin to exploit the land itself. The biggest silver mine in the world is in South America. It's in what is now Peru. It's exploited using slaves, not indigenous peoples. Again, African slaves begin to work in these mines very quickly. And it's this silver, some of which goes straight across the Pacific, which pays for all those cool things that the Asians are making, that the Chinese specifically are making. More importantly, perhaps for our story, over time you begin to get the emergence of what we call politely the Atlantic system, what's called more accurately the plantation complex, and what actually means slavery. You all know these images. I'm guessing you all know these images. You should all know these images. This is one of the horrors of human history. This is the slave boat. This is the thing you would have seen before you got on the slave boat. This is a slaving fort on what is now Gorée Island in Senegal. This is a horrific story, but it's also sometimes a slightly misleading story, because even as Europeans are exporting vast amounts of African-backed labor from the west coast of Africa, they're largely doing it on African terms. As in Asia itself, until the 19th century, Europeans are largely stranded on the edge of continents. They do not set up huge territorial colonies in the interior of Africa. And they are petitioning, this is in the very early years, this is the King of Congo, being petitioned by Europeans to participate in the slave trade. So it's a complicated story. It's a story that is actually very well told in the museum in Liverpool. I don't know if you guys know, there's a slavery museum now in Liverpool, which was one of the big slaving ports. Liverpool and Bristol, most of the wealth in those two towns originally comes from slavery. And Liverpool is making amends through a museum. So it's worth looking at it. But the point here is that Europeans are still stuck on the coasts. They're stuck on the coasts in India. They have small forts throughout Asia and Africa, but they're not yet dominating these places. That only begins to change in the 19th century. It changes first with this. This is what some people call the First World War. This was a conflict between France and England in the middle of the 18th century. It takes place in the Americas, it takes place in the Caribbean, it also takes place in India as well as the Mediterranean and so on. This is the moment at which England basically ends France's pretensions to imperial greatness. And on the basis of this, we begin to build now Britain begins to build its empire in North America, it begins to dominate the Caribbean, and it begins to dominate India for very simple reasons. In the wake of this, first we have a series of revolutions. The American Revolution, who's that? Washington, yeah. Who's this? This is the leader of the most important rebellion of all. This is the first slave rebellion. This is Toussaint Louverture in Haiti. And again, this comes directly out of this conflict. And finally, of course, Napoleon. All of these, in the wake of this First Global War, transform their societies. They transform what becomes the United States, they transform the Caribbean, they transform France. More important than that, though, is this. In the wake of these revolutions, the British begin to take over what becomes the jewel in the crown of empire. They begin to take over India in 1765. But this is early days here. Because if you go to the end of the 19th century, when we think that we should be able to write history from a European perspective, you will still see a British ambassador going to Beijing, getting down on his knees and petitioning this all-powerful Chinese emperor to be allowed to participate in trade. Still, almost 1800, Europe is still marginal. Europe is subordinate. Europe is on its knees to the real power in the global economy. And that only begins to change in the 19th century itself. It changes first with industry. Industry is a complicated story. Some of you might have studied the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution isn't in the end about inventions. But the important part about the Industrial Revolution is that over time, the inventions coming out of northwest England, Lancashire largely, are taken abroad, and this allows European forces to project force at a distance. This is the first Opium War. The only way we had of participating in the Chinese market was actually selling opium. Yes, we were the original drug dealers. So we sell opium, the Chinese don't want the opium, we say you have to have the opium, and if you don't want the opium, we're going to bomb you. So they bomb. And so the opium trade continues. With the inventions of the Industrial Revolution, now by the middle of the 19th century, we begin to impose our will. And again, we here as Britain. Over time, it allows us to build empire. Right next to SOAS, where I teach, which originally started as a colonial school, or a school for colonial administrators, we have the London School for Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who are the people who gave us the immunity so that finally white people could live in South Asia, in Africa, and so on. This is Cecil Rhodes, who is now bestriding the African continent, as you can see, this at the end of the 19th century. So we have industry, we have a military, we have empire, and finally, of course, we have race. It's at the end of the 19th century that we invent racism. This is a very tricky subject, but all indications, most historians now believe that it's only at the end of the 19th century that we begin to think of the world in terms of absolute differences between people with different skin pigmentation. Before that, we have a very different vision of things. And you can see that in this cartoon. This is the powers. This is a caricature of Queen Victoria, the Kaiser, Russia, France, represented by an imaginary woman, and of course Japan, and there's a racial element to this as well. All of these are caricatures. Carving up China at the end of the 19th century as this hideously caricatured Chinese man looks on in horror. So by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, the story has changed. But it takes that long. And it leads to a world like this, a world where the map is largely pink: India, East Africa, Australia, Canada. This is the map of empire. And it leads also to the 20th century, which is going to be fast. Normally, when we talk about the 20th century, these are the images that come to mind. On the left you have Auschwitz, on the right you have Hiroshima. I'm guessing most of you have studied some aspect of one of these events, and you should. These are the events which made it impossible for us to go back before 1945. Until 1945, we have a world of empire, we have a world in which I can mutter liberal platitudes about all people being equal, but in fact it's a world of hierarchy, it's a world of hideous violence, and it's a world of an arms race, where the person with the next biggest weapon is going to win. When we open the gates to Auschwitz and we discover what has happened there, when we go and see what has actually happened to Hiroshima in the wake of the atomic bomb, it becomes impossible to go back. Our moral calculus, if you like, changed after these events. And so it is right that we study them, but they only tell us one of the stories of the 20th century. This story is actually the story of political history that Europe has been writing from 1066. This is the story about conflicts between states, which are thought to be equal. But there are other stories in the 20th century that we need to know, and that I'm guessing most of you in this classroom know already. The second story we need to know is this story. This is not the story of states fighting each other, this is the story of colonizer and colonized. It's a story that starts kicking off more or less in 1919. These guys on the left are the first Tipperary Brigade. This leads to the founding of the Irish Republic. This is the first 20th century anti-colonial struggle. And the most famous face of the anti-colonial struggle, of course, is Gandhi. So we have two stories. We have a story of states fighting each other. We have a story of colonizers trying to confront the colonized who are not happy to be colonized. But also we have a third story, of course. We have this story. We have a story of people getting very wealthy and some people not being very happy about that. We have the story of communism. And this is a story that continues today. The first story might have ended in 1945. The second story did not. It's ongoing. We live in a post-colonial world. This story still is ongoing today. We have something called the Labour Party. Bob Crow just died, the most influential trade unionist of his generation. He died this morning at the age of 52. Yeah. This story is ongoing too. All these stories of the 20th century need to be told. We can't just tell the story of Hitler. How many of you have studied Hitler? Quite a few. There are other stories to tell too. The other point about this story is this story links us to economics. And today has been largely about economics because it's important. Because the 20th century, actually the story about it, is the story of this. If you look at these numbers, you begin to see what happened. And I want to go to my notes here because some of them are quite important. Peter's probably gesturing at me to stop. Are we okay? Quickly. Okay. The story of numbers in the 20th century is an important story. Because if we focus on the numbers, then it also begins to link to our everyday life. In the 20th century, we get massive population growth. We get people beginning to move. And we get people beginning to move around the world. Look at this classroom. And we also begin to get people moving into cities. Cities like London, global cities, vast cities, huge cities. And when we tell this story, we begin to link to our own lives. So not the story of wars and politics and international relations, but the story of how people live on an everyday level. Cities like this. Do you know where these are?
Yes, of course.
New York, the Statue of Liberty welcoming the poor, the idle, the tired masses. This is Shanghai, which is where my lot were in the early 20th century. My dad and his sister were born there, my grandmother was born there, they got evacuated in 1938. They'd never lived in England before, but for some reason they were English. The story of the 20th century is increasingly more and more people beginning to live in places like this, in cities. Now more than 50% of the planet lives in cities. And when you move into cities, when you move from little agricultural communities into cities, things change. You move from an extended family where you might have lived with your grandparents, with the back door open all the time, into largely nuclear families. From 3 generations to 2. This changes your world. You move from a world of religious certainty, and a lot of us I know are probably practicing in our religion, to one in which those certainties begin to be shaken. You begin to move to a world where you need distractions in order to cope with the horrors of your everyday existence. It might be jazz, it might be house music. It might be the cinema, it might be the internet, it might be gaming online. In cities, the world changes, and so when we move into cities in the 20th century, things begin to change for all of us. And things begin to change for the planet as a whole. This is the environmental story. And if you look at things like this, how the blue whale population has been decimated, how bird and animal species have been populated, how our carbon dioxide emissions are going up, then you realize that over the course of the 20th century, the planet has changed. Not simply because of people waging war in Europe, but because we have moved, and in moving, we have changed the world around us. And that's the world we need to study in history, and I want you all to come to SOAS to do it. Thanks.